Good day, everybody. Welcome to Commercial Week number 9. We're going to look at the commercial aspects of doing multi-residential properties and different institutions. This is a continuation of the last few commercial weeks where we have done the hotels, we've done gas stations, we've done manufacturing, we've done industrial. We've done land development, and this is the last segment on trying to look specifically at different kinds of commercial properties. The last session is week 10, and week 10 is a continuation of this, plus a little bit of a recap on what we've done throughout the whole course. So welcome, and we'll move this along here. So multi-residential properties, we'll look at multi-residential properties first. If you have a multi-residential property that you're either going to list or you're going to try to put an offer in on, if it's larger than 4 apartments, in other words, 5 or more, you are required to use a commercial form, okay? If you have 4 apartments or less, you can either put it on the commercial form, but you can also put it on a residential agreement as well. Okay, either one will suffice if you're 4 or less apartments. So do remember, 4 apartments or more, you're required to put it on a commercial form, which would be commercial form 500. Of course, we did go through the different forms and the types of forms earlier. I believe it was in the 5th or 6th session. So if you need a review of that, go back to the 5th or 6th session and we'll have that covered for you. When you're as a buyer and you're looking at a multi-residential home property, there's 10 different sections that you should be familiar with when you're representing a buyer. And that is, of course, these ones: HST, vacancy rates, ages of HVAC equipment, roof, pavement, and the overall building, the different maintenance records, what kind of management has happened, any extra incomes or amenities, and what are the rental rules for the property. And we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into these units, or into these subjects, I should say. HST, first of all. Of course, HST is always first, right? There is no HST collected on the sale of a multi-unit residential property. The reason why is because when you have a residential property, the owner of the property, the landlord of the property, is not permitted to collect HST on rents, okay? Residential property, residential rent, it's not $2,000 plus HST like it is in commercial. It is $2,000, no HST. Since it's not an HST revenue producing property, you cannot claim input tax credits back on expenses on the property, okay? So it's really important that you realize that the buyer realizes that if he has to fix the lobby when he buys it, he can't claim back an input tax credit on that. It's just going to be an expenditure for him. And so he's going to eat the 13% as well, okay? If it has, the property has, if it is a multi-unit property that has commercial space, and let's face it, there's lots of towers in Toronto that have, 30, 40 stories high. And at the bottom of those 30 or 40 stories, there's 1 or 2, sometimes even 3 stories of commercial space. When that happens, the division of square footage and the value of the commercial space are sort of bound together. They are tied together to determine how much HST is applicable for the commercial space. The reason why HST is payable on the commercial space is because commercial space revenue generates HST, $2,000 a month plus HST. And there's a calculation done by an appraiser to figure out how much HST is applicable to the commercial space and how much not HST is applicable to the residential space. So you've heard me say it many, many times before to you guys: consult the buyer's accountant when it comes to HST to make sure there's nothing crazy going on, okay? Builders of new multi-unit residential properties can claim portions of HST back just the same way as they can for a single family house, like a single family condo. Usually usually when a person purchases a condo, for example, they're signing off their builder's portion of HST to be refunded back to the builder. So if it's a brand new, if the buyer is buying a brand new multi-unit residential property, and they could discuss the HST from the builder, and it becomes a negotiation part. So once again, HST is complicated. You should be aware about HST. You should know about HST. You should know about input tax credits, and you should have a general idea of how HST flows through. On if you have a look, we talked about it in session 4. We talked about HST in detail. We looked at paragraph 7 on Form 500 that explains on how HST works. You should be aware of it. But once again, you should always tell your buyer to consult their accountant or lawyer. Lawyers should know, real estate lawyers would know all about HST. And actually, just talking about real estate lawyers, an issue came up the other day in a commercial deal that it appeared that the lawyer really didn't know, and I hate to say that a lawyer didn't know what he was doing, but the lawyer really was not aware of how to do some things. And one of the things he was not aware to do was how HST was flowed through. And when I asked the agent to check with their buyer on what lawyer it was, it turned out that it was a divorce lawyer. And the lawyer had never done a real estate deal before. For goodness sake, if you're into a multi-residential property like this, or any of the properties that we've discussed in the last 3 or 4 weeks, then for goodness sake, make sure your buyer is talking to a real estate lawyer, not a family lawyer, okay? I love this slide. Let me know if you need advice on how to totally screw up your taxes this year. For goodness sake, folks, make sure that you are steering your buyer, and your seller for that matter, to an accountant that knows what they are doing in terms of real estate. Don't you be the real estate agent that gives you advice, that gives your client advice on how to totally screw up your taxes, okay? Make sure you're referring them always to an accountant, perhaps even to the point where you're going to put conditions in the offer for an accountant's or a lawyer's review of the deal so that your buyer is protected. Vacancy rates. Well, we're living through this right now, aren't we? I'm for those of you who are following these, that's great. But for those of you who are not, I am recording this in November 17th, 2020, right in the middle of COVID. And last year, the vacancy rate was at 2.3%, up from 1.4% from 2018. Okay. This year, right now, vacancy rates are creeping up to 3.5%. In some areas in Toronto, they're 4.5%, and vacancy rates are creeping up. Vacancy rates are really an important consideration for a buyer considering the purchase of a multi-residential unit. And of course, as we're living through this COVID in November, as we all know now, the vacancy rates are at the point now where rental prices are starting to drop. Prices are starting to drop. Why? Because there's a ton of inventory on the market right now because of COVID and a lack of immigration coming into the GTA. Not only a lack of immigration, but a lack of student rentals. Airbnbs are totally discouraged now because of COVID, that kind of thing. And, you can bet that buyers that may have been looking at buying a multi-residential unit I'm talking about the Toronto's kind of downtown core, that they may have been looking at March, but I can tell you what, they're not looking today, unless there's a really good deal on a value, a really good price on a property. And so buyers definitely look at what's happening in the vacancy market before they make a decision on purchasing a multi-residential unit. Now, on the outskirts of Toronto, when you get into Barrie and you get into Orangeville, or you get into Ajax or Oshawa, where a lot of people are trying to leave the city, you can get a lot more bang for your buck. You can get a lot more room for $2,000 a month in Ajax than you can in the city of Toronto. And so people will definitely look at vacancy rates when they're looking at multi-residential properties. It's a really, really, really important consideration. Not only are just general vacancy rates important, this was 2017. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to upgrade this slide, but it's going to be roughly the same for every year. Bachelor apartments, vacancy rates are higher. One of the things that's happening today in COVID time is the smaller units. There's just a ton of availability now. I don't know the statistic for sure, but I'm going to say 4.5% to 5% vacancy rates for bachelor apartments. Those are the ones that are, the 400 square foot apartments that are, nobody wants to live in them anymore. There's no room. A lot of people are working from home. They can't just live in a 400 or 500 square foot apartment, work from home and then live there as well without being able to get out. You can imagine that's difficult to do. And so there's a lot of availability for that. Why? Because in downtown Toronto, you could rent one of those for $1,800 or $1,700. And now you can go to Orangeville and rent a townhouse for $1,700. And so since you're working at home, why be in downtown Toronto? And you can see the difference. The 2 bedrooms are the most popular, of course, and that would be the same today because people can have an office in one room and they can have a bedroom in another room, and they kind of have a little bit of separation from what they're doing. And the square footage is a little more reasonable, and price-wise, it's a little more reasonable. The 3-bedroom homes shows a little bit more vacancy. They're just not as popular in terms of raising a family in a 3-bedroom condo, when today you can go out and buy a house in Pickering for roughly the same amount of money that you're going to pay for a 3-bedroom condo. And people are trying to get away from stuff. So this COVID situation gives you a really stark, a very simple black and white. Here's what's happening because of vacancy rates, and people are going to look very carefully at vacancy rates once again, especially now. And they'll be looking for deals in multi-residential properties instead of paying top dollar like they would have back in 2017 when vacancy rates were below 1%, or well, the average was 1%. Okay. So when you're talking to people about buying their apartments, then they're going to look at vacancy rates very carefully. Sellers, on the other hand, want to ignore this, right? Because what's happening? Bachelor apartments are way up here now. 2-bedroom apartments are over here somewhere, right? The city average is somewhere over here, right? Way up here somewhere at 3%. And sellers need to be told this as well, that you know what, you might not get as much as you would have in 2018 because the vacancy rates are so high. The next important consideration is age. Ages of HVAC, roof, pavement, windows, and age of the overall building. Inspections are necessary to determine the age and therefore the quality of systems. A standard home inspector is not going to be able to do this, okay? There are going to be inspectors that are going to be necessary in each department. Now, if you're looking at a fourplex, maybe a general home inspector can muddle their way through this, and they probably can if the home inspector has some good experience. All right, home inspectors who regularly do residential properties are allowed to inspect by their own rules up to 4 units in the same property. If the property has more than 4 units, you need an AACI inspector, and we'll go into that in just a minute here. Oops, sorry. Go back here for a second. So the age of HVAC equipment, the age of the roof and pavement and windows. Why are these things important? Well, often there's a central plant that heats the property, and the individual homeowners have their own thermostats. And if you have lousy windows in the place, guess what? The homeowners, or the unit holder, whatever, has got the thermostat cranked way out because there's a breeze coming through the window all the time. That's going to cost the landlord money. And, landlords don't want to spend money. If any of you have been landlords like me, I don't want to spend money either. And so age of windows is one of those things that's really important. Age of the roof. Does the roof have to be replaced in the next 5 to 10 years? If you're talking a multi-unit residential building, 20, 30, 40, 50 units, you can bet that roof is expensive to replace. Just imagine what that would cost. I actually have no idea. HVAC equipment, how old is it? How good condition is it in? Does it have to be replaced? And then, of course, pavement outside as well would have to be dealt with as well, for sure. And you just have to consider all that in the age of the overall building. And so you need inspectors for all of this stuff. You can't just get one general inspector unless, like I said, you need it's a relatively small unit. Maybe they can do it for you. Okay. You want to get professionals in this. Maintenance. How well has the property been maintained? I was dealing with an agent just the other day who was looking at a sixplex, and they were asking a fair amount of money for it. The capitalization rate was about 3.5%. So the asking price was reasonable compared to their notice of their NOI. Everything added up. The rent was good, and vacancy rates were low in that unit. It was in a good location. Everything was working out really, really, really well until they actually went to look at the property, and it had not been maintained at all. And so today it's great, no problem at all. Okay, but this stuff was not very good. It had not been well maintained. And so I think they're negotiating right now for a bit of a lower price so that they can take care of this stuff. Don't forget that under the tenancy board, with the tenancy board in Ontario, that in general, rent increases are limited to a pretty low percentage. And so you may have to spend $1 million on a place, but you can't recoup that in a year. You might only be able to recoup that in years coming. And so you do have to be careful about maintenance. Okay, you cannot increase substantially without approval of the tenancy board. Immediate repairs cannot be covered by immediate rent increases. And just once again, in COVID time, rent cannot be increased substantially without approval of the tenancy board. Well, I was told the other day to even get a hearing at the tenancy board, you're looking at least 8 months for something that's not important. Okay, if it's an eviction and it's bad and the police and all that stuff, you can get a hearing in maybe 6 months today, but in general 8 months. So there you go, and you spend all that money. You apply for an increase past what the tenancy board allows, and your hearing's not even heard for 8 months. And so you do have to have a close look at maintenance, which is tied into the previous slide, of course, for age. Good run buildings, I should say good run, well-run buildings will have maintenance records that have been kept, okay? It can be the replacement of assets. So, Mr. Buyer, here you go. Here's the maintenance record. The windows were all replaced in 2017. Well, that's fantastic, okay? They can be ongoing maintenance, janitorial, fire inspections, well-run buildings. And I'm thinking this isn't just a landlord with a sixplex or an eightplex. So you would hope for that size that they are keeping proper records. Not all of them do. They just sort of go by the seat of their pants. Why? Oh, because they have their friend come and fix something and they pay them cash, and there's no maintenance record of what's happened. There's no receipts. There's nothing like that they can prove that things have been done. That definitely happens out there. That kind of relationship. Cash payments, it happens everywhere all the time in just about every sector of society today. And it's no different for getting stuff fixed, okay? So the building overall can have a maintenance records, but each unit can also have maintenance records. So they should have a record of repairs. Mostly the time this is plumbing related. And, is the tap dripping? Well, who's paying for the water? Well, often the landlord pays for the water in a huge building. There aren't separate meters. I mean, sometimes in condos there's separate meters, of course, but not always. And who's taking care of this stuff? There has to be proper maintenance. Okay. Here's another one: the balcony. When was the last time balcony had been checked for safety? Okay. If it's an older building, the balcony sticks out, 5 feet, whatever. And when was the last time that was checked for safety? Maintenance, it's everything. And that's to do with the property management company in either a condo or whoever's taking care of the fiveplex or sixplex or sevenplex. Or do you have a good superintendent or a good superintendent team that is taking care of the properties that can give you proper maintenance records? It's really, really important. It's no different than a residential property that you want a home inspection, right? You want to see that things are working properly. And when the home inspector comes through, that, the furnace turns on and the air conditioner turns on, and, there's hot water coming out of the hot water taps and the toilet's not running constantly and that kind of thing. If you walk into a house and the air conditioner turns on and it makes a terrible grinding noise, and then you go and look at the washrooms and there's a tap that's leaking and the toilet's leaking, and then you look at some windows and they haven't cleaned the windows in a few years and there's been condensation and there's black mold on the edge of the windows, you kind of go, how well is this place actually being kept up overall? I mean, we're just looking at the outside stuff. What about the bones of the place? Has that been taken care of? And people who are buying multi-residential units are looking for the same kind of clues. Extra income in multi-residentials, okay? Does it have laundry service? Even in a sixplex sometimes, or even in a fourplex, I've seen it. There's a washer and dryer in the basement, a coin washer and dryer. And that coin washer and dryer can, believe it or not, be a substantial source of income for the owner or the landlord, whoever it is. In a picture, in a building like on the right-hand side that I've got on this slide, where I'm not sure how many units are here, but maybe they've got 4 washers and 4 dryers. Those things are cash cows for landlords. And so you want to make sure that you've been through the whole building when you're showing. Just don't show a few units and walk out. What else do they got? Is there guest parking fees? Is there a party room that people can rent? Sometimes there's guest suites in places that, that there's a couple of 1 bedrooms or even bachelor units that people can rent out for their guests, and they can be definitely extra income. Of course, that'll be on the net operating income statement if there are things like this. Should be anyways. Maybe not the laundry because it's cash, but the rest of it should be. Amenities. These are costs. If there's a pool, pools are really expensive to maintain, to winterize in the fall, to de-winterize in the spring. Depending on how deep it is, my goodness, you need a lifeguard depending on how big it is. Are you following all the safety rules from the city or the municipality that you're dealing with? A pool can be very expensive. So can a gym, a workout area. Why are these things expensive? Well, first of all, there's the maintenance of the equipment. And like I said, the pool, but the landlord might need extra liability insurance to run a pool or a gym. Now, once again, that should show up on the income statements on what that is, but maybe it'll turn a buyer off because a pool is not a revenue producing item, and either is a gym, it's included in. And so are the rents matching to have these extra facilities? Barbecue areas, what about landscaping for the place? In our climate, you've got to make sure the grass looks nice and the flowers look nice. I mean, if it's all dumpy, then guess what? The rents are lower. And so this is the kind of thing that buyers are going to look at. But once again, I'll flip the coin. You have a seller. How well is this stuff being maintained? All right. If it's a dumpy place, well, guess what, Mr. Seller? you can't expect to get as much money as you thought it was worth. And also the one extra thing I want to talk about here, and I should just go back here just for a moment to vacancy rates. And the thing about the vacancy rates, of course, is how long have some people been in there? And so there's some landlords, what they've done is they've had a tenant, a very good tenant in the place, okay, but they have not done the increase every year because they're so good. They're worried about losing the tenant. So a lot of people are paying under what market rent is today, and you can't get rid of that tenant under the Tenancy Act. And so you're kind of stuck with a person who's paying underneath market value today, which is difficult to do. The last thing I wanted to say about vacancy rates, and I forgot to mention it as well, I'm sorry, was of course Premier Ford just announced that no rent increases in 2021 for anything. So let me continue on here. Sorry to jump around like that, but I'd forgotten that. NOI. I know you guys are all tired of me doing NOI. But here it goes. Once again, a multi-unit residential property is no different from any other commercial venture. What is the net operating income? Pretty simple, you guys. What are the cap rates? You know, if you're looking at cap rates for a big building, there's A, B, and C cap rates. We talked about this way back in weeks 1 or 2 about the different class subjects. But what about just the 4 or 6plex? They don't have cap rates. You know, what you have to do then is you have to figure out what's a good return on income for your buyer. Are they happy with a 3% or a 4% return? That kind of thing. You know, you just want to make sure that the rent that is being charged annually minus the expenses that the landlord or seller has to pay still leaves a little bit of money left over for the buyer. And we looked at that in sessions 2 and 3, where you know, we looked at what happens when you have to add a mortgage in to a cost, and what happens to your return on your income and all that good stuff. So you really do want to make sure that your net operating income statement, whether they have one or not, if it's a small one, they might just say, well, here's what it is, and nothing fancy. But in a big unit, they will have net operating income statements just like any other business. So ask for it. You know, when you're representing the buyer, or of course, if you're representing the seller, so that you can determine a price, you need the net operating income. The Tenancy Act. This is a little bit older now. Most of you should know this, that under the Tenancy Act today, there's a new standard form of lease. This has really got nothing to do with what we've just been talking about. It's just a reminder that there is a standard form of lease that must be completed. If you're doing a lease, it's Form 400 on AREA. And once you have an agreed upon tenancy with all the terms, you need to complete the standard form of lease. Okay. I do want to remind everybody that in 2020, the increase was permitted to be 2.2%. But you always have to give written notice to tenants 90 days prior to the increase, only once in a 12-month period. 90 days notice to the tenant. You can always look up through Tribunals Ontario, the Landlord and Tenant Board, what the rent increases are. And the guidelines, of course, state that it does not apply to rental units first occupied for residential purposes after November 15th. First occupied is the key word there. However, Premier Ford, once again, this is the middle of November 2020, they've frozen rents for these properties as well for 2021. And so there's definitely some exceptions to rent increases, but you're probably not going to get into a lot of this stuff, okay? Let's move into institutions. And there's 4 different institutions that we'll talk about. The first is daycares, private schools, nursing homes, retirement homes, and churches. Institutions. Okay. Institutions in general. In general, you should be conditional upon the appropriate ministry government approval. Okay. They have different types of government approvals for different kinds of institutions. For daycares, you have the Ministry of Education and Child Care and Early Years Act. You would hope that if somebody is starting a daycare, that they are aware of this already, okay? Not always, okay? Some people just think, oh, I think I'll just buy something and start a daycare. Well, great. Have you looked at the Child Care and Early Years Act to run a daycare? Have you looked at the provincial guidelines to running a daycare? You can't just open a daycare. It's not as simple as that. There's lots of safety and stuff. Private schools, once again, the Ministry of Education, and it's the legal requirements established by the Education Act. Once again, if somebody wants to open a private school, hopefully they have some clue of what they're doing here. Nursing homes, definitely. Nursing homes, Long-Term Care Homes Act of 2007, and it has been amended from time to time as well for nursing homes. And places of worship need their own organization approval, and the Religious Organizations Act of 1990. So you need to be, once again, you need to be aware of these things, okay? But you need to know all this stuff. What's in all this stuff? No, you're not an expert. The buyer should be the expert in these things, not you. But should you be aware of it so that you can protect your buyer in an offer? And of course you should be. So before we get into daycares and private schools, just going to give you a quick rundown on nursing homes or retirement homes. Nursing homes and retirement homes are probably beyond the scope of this course. They are so heavily regulated today that it is really, really, really difficult to run them. And basically there's 2 or 3 nursing homes and retirement home companies. Sienna Living is one of them that have really sort of got the market on this kind of nursing home or retirement home. And there's not too many individual people who are going to just think it's a great idea to start a nursing home or retirement home. And let's face it, during COVID, it's probably definitely not something anyone's going to want to get into for the next few years. I believe there's a real shortage of nursing homes, as we've all read about in the last few months. Equally, there's a shortage of retirement homes. And the reason why there's such shortages are the rules and regulations are just unbelievable. In nursing homes, the rent that you are allowed to charge is heavily regulated by the ministry. I think it's the Ministry of Health, or maybe there's actually a Ministry of Nursing Homes, I can't remember. And I don't think many of you or even myself, we're just not going to run into this thing. It'd be very, very, very rare. Churches definitely are for sale, without question. I think there's one just up from me here in Richmond Hill on Yonge Street that there's a whole property. If you ever get a buyer for it, it'll probably sell, but not too many buyers will pay what they're asking. Churches you can buy. Churches in the country come up for sale, and they've been renovated into year-round living residences. People like to do that kind of stuff. But churches are pretty heavily regulated by places of worship, their own organization, and the Religious Organization Act of 1990. And so to buy a church that is owned by the Catholic Diocese of Ontario, also, I believe at the end of the day, needs a rubber stamp from the Vatican in Rome before it's permitted to be sold. It is a long, long, long process to buy a church that is still owned by the religious organization. I dealt with a United Church in a small town that took 18 months to get the approval for the deal to go through. The wheels of Bureaucracy and church organizations move very, very, very slowly. If there happens to be a cemetery attached to a church, then there's a Cemetery Act, and I can't remember exactly what year it is, but there's definitely a Cemetery Act out there in the province of Ontario. I don't know about other states or other provinces, but there's a Cemetery Act that really is very strict about what you can do and what you can't do and how this has to transfer ownership when there is a cemetery involved. If just talking about cemeteries briefly, a little bit of a turn away from this, sometimes there's a large acreage that you can purchase for your buyers. And in a little tiny corner of that, there's an old cemetery. It brings to mind one that's at the corner of Jane and King Road, south on Jane on the east side. There's a tiny little cemetery there. And if you wanted to buy that whole piece of land, you're going to get involved with the Cemetery Act for sure. So nursing homes, you probably won't run into them a lot. Places of worship, it could happen. You should be aware that it requires the rubber stamp of the particular church, and the Religious Organization Land Act of 1990 also comes into play for nursing, for places of worship. So I don't have any further slides about those two. They're pretty rare. And now we're going to move into daycare and private schools. So daycares and private schools, it's all about safety, of course. But believe it or not, I have parking at the very, very top of the list. And parking is a huge roadblock. Parking roadblock. It's a huge roadblock for people trying to open up daycares and private schools. Okay, parking is immensely important. Municipalities do not want people overflowing onto streets, so a little bit is okay, but in general, they want all the parking in there for enough for the staff, of course. If it is an adult education where people will be driving, then you need enough parking for all the students. If it is for people who are under the age of 16, an elementary, I guess, kind of setting, a Montessori school that is, you know, for grades 1 to 6 or something like that, or JK to 6, then the kids are not driving, obviously, and there'll be easier rules for parking, and, you know, more so just for staff and for pickup and drop off and things like that. Okay. You can also see the difference if you just drive around the neighborhood and you take a look at some schools. You'll see the high schools have huge parking lots. Why? Because older kids in high schools can drive, and so there's a calculation for that. Whereas if you drive by an elementary school, the parking lot is relatively small because only the teachers have to be able to park there. So parking is a huge consideration. Road access is another one. Is there good ingress and egress onto a road? All right. And so, you know, is it a busy street? Well, if it's a busy street and all of a sudden you have an adult school in the spot, and all of a sudden there's a ton of cars entering and getting in and out of driveways, regulations may not permit that. Is there handicap access into the property? For schools on the main floor of properties or on the second floor, even some municipalities mandate an elevator for handicap access. What about playgrounds? There's a great property up at, was it Devonshire and Young, where they've kind of fenced in a little bit of a playground. The ministry wants that kids can get outside. It's really important. Fire code, of course. Washrooms, of course. And sometimes to run daycares and private schools, depending on what kind you're doing and that kind of thing, certainly I believe for younger kids, the buyers might need a criminal check. You know, if the buyer obviously has a criminal record of, maybe drunk driving, you know, maybe that's not going to work. Maybe the ministry is not going to give a license for something like that. So these are all questions that buyers should know the answers to already. And you should know as an agent about these things. But for example, once again, what about the fire code? Well, do you need to know how many sprinklers are required in a 3,000 square foot unit? No. Should you know that you should talk to your buyer about the fire code, and maybe you should put a condition in an offer to protect the buyer if you don't see any sprinklers, as an example, or there's only one sprinkler, for example. And you want to talk to your buyer about this and be aware of all of these things to protect your buyer. HST on institutions. Believe me, HST on institutions is beyond the scope of this course. Simple as that, okay? And the reason why is some forms of education, from my limited understanding of this, some forms of education you can charge HST upon. And I believe your real estate licenses that you got, you paid HST on, okay? If that real estate office ever came up for sale, it would probably attract HST. I don't believe, but I'm not 100% sure of this, that a Montessori school collects HST. And as a result of that, the HST on a building may not be applicable either. So there's all sorts of funny rules and regulations on institutions, on churches, on nursing homes, on schools, all of that. HST is a really, really complicated subject. You need, of course, to direct your buyer to an accountant. Commercial appraisers, okay? Commercial appraisers are AACIs, accredited appraiser from the Canadian Institute designation. Once again, we just talked about this a few minutes ago, but just as a reminder, an AACI is the next step above a general residential appraiser. The Bank of Montreal hires a general residential appraiser. It's called a CRA, a Canadian Residential Appraiser, okay? And an AACI is definitely a step above that. It's much more education, it's much more apprenticeship work, that kind of thing. If your unit is over 4, once again, four units in a residential setting, you need an AACI. Most buildings that are sold commercially require an AACI designation. A bank will not accept a CRA. And most CRAs are not trained to do these kind of in-depth looks at income statements and highest and best uses and that kind of thing. An AACI appraisal can cost thousands and thousands of dollars and could take weeks and maybe even, depending on the complexity, a few months to obtain, okay? It's one of the reasons why for financing, you need to have a long financing clause. Bank approvals, sometimes just like residential, are hinging on the appraiser's report. But in this case, an AACI could take weeks and maybe months to obtain. And so the financing condition has to be very, very, very long as well. The financing condition, of course, we talked about financing, I believe, in number 6, week 6, maybe 5. That it does take a long time because of appraisals, and also that the bank is going to go with a fine-tooth comb through any operating income statements, any receipts, bills, appraisals, whatever else they're doing, inspections, all of that kind of stuff. But one of the reasons for sure is that the actual appraisal determining the value of the property can take weeks and sometimes months to obtain. AACIs are not regular residential appraiser. A residential appraiser in general right now, I think in the GTA, $350, maybe $400, maybe $325, somewhere in there, where AACI is definitely over $1,000, if not more, thousands and thousands of dollars. So homework, here's your last chance to do homework. And if you want to do it, you're more than welcome to send in the information to me. You should be able to email me the answers to johnsmulders@century21.ca. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure doing these with everybody. And of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give me a call.